guys, welcome to The Bite. My name is Jackie. Today's video I'm going to be sharing with you a really delicious and easy butternut squash risotto. I have been making this for a couple years now and it's just a really great way to feel satiated, get some veggies in, and just feel like you're eating at a restaurant. Risotto can sound a little bit intimidating because it does require you to sit over the stove and slowly pour in the broth, but it's really simple. There are very few things on this table that you really need, and you're gonna end up with something restaurant quality, absolutely delicious. And butternut squash is in season, so I figured this is a great time to share this recipe. So let me show you what you'll need. So I have some butternut squash that I have cut up into little cubes like this. This is half of a medium onion, or if you have a small onion, you can use the whole thing and just finely dice it. I've got some ground sage and some Italian seasoning, arborio rice. You have to use arborio rice for risotto. You don't want to use anything other than arborio rice because this is the type of rice that will slowly release its starch and it does not need to be rinsed and drained at all. Some butter, some salt and pepper, and then I also have some vegetable broth, or you can use chicken broth, and it's on the back stove warming up because it needs to be warm once we add it to our risotto. If you wanted, you can add some white wine. That's very traditional in risotto. However, I don't want to open up an entire bottle of wine because I'm not going to be drinking it right now. It's going to be a couple months before I can drink it right now. But if you add like half a cup, 3/4 of a cup in the very beginning, and I'll tell you when if you choose to, it would be great. I'm just gonna be adding completely stock today. So let's head to the stove and get started. So I have a pretty large saucepan here with high sides. You want it to have high sides because the rice will expand. And to that, I'm just going to add in the butter. And by the way, all the measurements and ingredients will always be on my blog like usual for all my recipes. I get a lot of people that have trouble finding my recipes. They're always there. If I have a recipe on YouTube, it's on the blog, and vice versa. So you can always find it there. It's the first link in the description box. So I'm just gonna melt this butter, add in both the onions and the butternut squash, and let them soften a bit. Okay, this is looking good. The onions have softened, but the butternut squash is gonna take a while for it to soften, just because it is a harder squash. A tip for that, you really want to cut them all evenly so that they cook evenly, and you don't want them to be too large because you want them to finish cooking once the risotto is done. So I like small pieces like this. They're not gonna completely dissolve. You'll still see distinguished pieces of butternut squash, which I like, but they're going to be melt in your mouth. They're not gonna be mush, if you know what I'm saying. So at this point, I like to add my seasonings, a little bit of salt and pepper, not too much salt because we're going to be finishing this with Parmesan cheese, and we also have the broth, which has salt in it. I like to use vegetable broth, but I have a hard time finding low sodium vegetable broth for whatever reason. And I mentioned this in my mushroom wild rice soup video, but this is what I use. This is better than bouillon. It's like a bouillon paste basically, and it stays in the fridge. And you're supposed to use 1 teaspoon of this with each cup of water. I have like 5.5, 6 cups of water here, and I use 4 teaspoons, and that's my way of getting a low sodium vegetable broth. You can use chicken broth, whatever you want. If you want to keep this completely vegan, use the veggie broth and sub out the butter or olive oil, and it'll be just as delicious because the risotto has that naturally creamy texture to it without adding any cream. And you don't have to add Parmesan cheese if you don't want to, but you know I'm gonna add my Parmesan cheese. So the spices are getting nice and toasty, and I'm going to add in, oh, it smells so good. The butter with the onions and the squash is just like fall. It just smells like fall to me. So at this point, I add in the risotto rice, and you want it to get kind of toasty. You want it to kind of soak up what little butter is left in the pan. And once that happens, if you were adding wine, you would add it now. And that would be the first portion of liquid that you're adding to the risotto. I'm not using wine today, so I'm going to be adding in broth. you can kind of see the grains of the risotto rice start to become a little translucent. And that's how you know that you're ready to add in the broth. So I do it about a cup at a time, or let's see. I'm gonna do 2 ladlefuls. And you do have to stay here and stir it until the arborio rice has soaked up all that liquid. Once the arborio rice soaks up this liquid, you can add another couple, I'm actually gonna lower this to medium. It was on high. That soaked up pretty fast because it was on high. It shouldn't have been on high. Pregnancy brain. But I think that in about another minute, I'm going to add in another couple ladlefuls of the broth. You're gonna continue doing that until the rice is cooked, the butternut squash has softened, and then you're ready to eat. So we're about halfway through, and you can see that rice really starting to cook. The butternut squash is already starting to become pretty fork tender, which is a good sign that it's almost fully cooked. I ended up adding another cup of liquid, a cup of water to my broth, just because I could tell based on the amount of liquid that I had left and how much longer the rice needed to cook, that it was going to end up being thick. And you don't want, when you first make the risotto, you don't want it to be thick like this. You want it to be a little bit looser because as it cools, it does thicken because it's rice. It has starch, and anything with starch is automatically gonna thicken in the fridge overnight. Leftovers, this is a different story, but you want it to be a lot looser when you eat it initially, right when you make it. So I added another cup of broth in there. Otherwise, other than that, it's looking good. Again, all the measurements and ingredients will be on my blog in the description link down below. So I'm gonna finish this up, put on some grated Parmesan cheese, and we're ready to serve it up. Okay, so once it kind of looks like this and you're towards the end of your broth, I want you to see the texture of the butternut squash. It's fork tender, and you want to taste your rice, you want to taste for seasoning at this point. Make sure that everything is fully cooked, you're not tasting crunchy bits of rice, and that the seasoning is just right. I'm going to turn off both the broth and the risotto, and I'm gonna add the last bit of this risotto. That's more than a ladle full, that's okay. I want it off the heat so that it continues. First I want to stir it on here a little bit, but I want it to continue to stay kind of light and runny so that as it cools, it doesn't get too thick. So this is looking good. I just want to make sure that the broth is fully incorporated. I'm gonna go pull out my Parmesan cheese, bring this to the table, and we can serve it up. It's looking beautiful. I'm just going to grate some Parmesan cheese. And this just adds a nice, rich creaminess and nuttiness that goes really well with the butternut squash and just risotto in general. So I have to add it. And one thing I learned from Giada De Laurentiis many years ago is to keep the rinds from your Parmesan cheese. As long as it's Parmigiano Reggiano, like the imported kind, you can save the rinds. And when you're making things like marinara sauce or like a stew, you can stick the rind in there. You don't want to eat it, but it's going to lend a really nice creaminess and richness very subtly. And it does a lot to food, and I like to do that. So I keep those in my freezer. I'm just going to stir this up really quick, and you can see that it is not thick. It is smooth. It is still pretty light in texture, and it just looks perfect. To me, this looks absolutely perfect. I would be very happy getting this in a restaurant. I actually have a mushroom truffle risotto. That was I think that was like my third video that I have ever filmed. So if the quality is a little bit different and I sound a little bit different, it's because I was new to the whole YouTube thing. So I'm just going to serve myself up a little bit now that the cheese is fully mixed in. Look at how beautiful this looks. Ooh, I want a little extra cheese on mine. Let me know if you can relate. All right. Alrighty. And see that butternut squash? It's like creamy. You want this in your life. You really do. This is beautiful fall comfort food. I know it's a little bit tedious, standing by the stove, stirring it, but you end up with something, I mean, just so beautiful, so delicious. You can't beat it. You can't beat risotto. I think it's delicious, I think it's easy, and it's very few ingredients, and there's so many different ways you can make risotto. And again, because it's creamy without adding cream, it's really easy to make risotto dishes vegan. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you give this a try, don't forget to tag me on Instagram or Facebook. I'm there on The Bite with Jackie. All my social media names are cohesive now, so you can find me on all the platforms. And I hope you enjoyed. Give this a try, and we'll see you next time on The Bite.